Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Welcome back for another installment of Marvel Snap Zone's weekly tier list for hit card battler Marvel Snap. We look forward to kind of sharing some of the updates, shakers, and movers of this week in the kind of Marvel Snap metagame, give you an idea of what's going on the ladder, what we think maybe a few people aren't exploring enough, and kind of those powerhouse cards you should be hoping to open from your collector's caches. We've taken on board some of your feedback from the last week, updated the list a little bit. So I wanted to play around with the idea of some budget builds towards the end that maybe can challenge these top competitors and give you a shot if you're missing a few cards from these decks. In addition to that, we're looking to publish some content over on the website focused towards taking these decks and scaling them down. So if you're missing a few of the cards from these, hopefully some articles on the site will be able to give you an idea of how to play them while you're waiting to find the cards that you maybe don't necessarily have. That being said, if you do have any feedback or any comments about this tier list or about anything that we do over at Marvel Snap Zone, please let us know in the comments below or come and contact us in our Discord on the website or your preferred method of communication. Last but not least, if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to this YouTube channel. We want to do more with it. We want to support Marvel Snap and help just grow the game in general. So if you are enjoying the podcasts, any future content we might make, and especially these weekly tier lists, just hit that button for us, turn on notifications, because it really does help one way or the other. As always, I'm going to start today's list off just by popping the graphic on the screen. So if all you care about is the information, all you want to know is where things have moved to and how we rate things, you'll be able to grab that screenshot and take it on your merry way. Alternatively, you can of course find that same screenshot on our article on MarvelSnapZone.com. But if you do want more information about these decks, you want to know how they play, what's changed, and what I think personally, I'm going to walk you through them afterwards, kind of card by card, let you know how they play, and just give you an idea of what you should expect should you come up against them. So without further ado, let's take a look at our grand list for this week. So you might notice actually a little bit bigger than last week. That's mostly due to this new budget tier that we've put in. But you'll see a lot of things have remained mostly the same in the middle of the metagame. Not a lot of movement in Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4. But the top of the metagame, moving around just a little bit. We are kind of seeing, excuse me, just kind of seeing a brand new addition at the very top of the game in Serra Negative, which is kind of combining the best of two existing decks. We'll get into that very shortly. But Deathwave making itself still a metagame staple at the top there, and the Serra Miracle deck moving itself up just a smidge back into Tier 1 this week. The traditional Mr. Negative deck does make itself a Tier 2 deck this week. Falls just a little bit, mostly because it finds itself being inferior to this brand new Serra Negative archetype. A lot of Tier 2 and Tier 3 remaining the same this week. Sandwave, Lockdown, the Hella Discard deck, Discard combo, mostly making up Tier 2 there for you. Tier 3, Destroyer, Bounce, Movement, Discard, Swarm, Patriot and Cerebro 6 finding themselves in a Tier 4. And then this new budget tier we're talking about, looking at some things you can do with the card pool you have. If you're missing out on some of these big pool 3 haymakers, we're going to be looking at a Sandman aggro deck, an on-reveal control deck that is purely built from Pool 2. It's been seen to be very popular over on Reddit. Definitely worth highlighting. And of course, a discard swarm list, very similar to that we featured on the list before. Going to be close to the one that you see in Tier 4, but scaled back to be Pool 2 only to kind of let you challenge these top tier decks. So that's where we are this week. That is everything you see on our tier list. And we're looking forward to kind of breaking these down, letting you know what's going on with these new archetypes, and kind of just explaining why things have stayed where they are. So let's take a look at these decks in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the big update of this week is this Serra Negative deck, so very politely referred to as Negative Serotonin by our friend Den here on the website. This deck is really sweet and is kind of taking the best of some existing archetypes, smashing it together, and finding the missing pieces that kind of make those cards synergistic together that maybe that people hadn't noticed before. It is a really Pool 3 heavy deck, but it's definitely something to work towards, and is currently definitely the mainstay of the ladder in that infinite rank. So if you want to know more about this, it is kind of a further focus on a deck involving two big like swingy cards in the form of Mr. Negative and Serra. These are kind of known mainstays of the game at this point, but if we combine them together, we're kind of cheating in all the ways that we're allowed to cheat. We're reducing costs as best we can on those baseline stats to give us like a really good rate way above that we should. But if you combine Mr. Negative and Serra together, you're getting these really supreme energy discounts, while also having a deck that can focus and like function reliably if you only draw one of those payoffs, or sometimes none of those payoffs, which is really, really incredible. We're looking to kind of abuse existing ongoing effects in this deck in some capacity. We've got cards you'd expect to see in these Mr. Negative shells like Iron Man, Wolfbane, Angela, things that if you switch their stats are going to be fantastic on rate. And we're really looking to abuse Iron Man with Mystique in this as well, which Mystique obviously playing very well with Mr. Negative, even better with Serra, and giving you an additional copy of that Iron Man ongoing effect. Mystique also really good with Mojo in this deck as well, very capable of just kind of giving you stupid amounts of stats for essentially no resources on the last turn of the game. A really sweet inclusion in this deck as well in the form of Rogue. Rogue, not one you see all too often in these decks, does play very well with everything we're trying to do, brings itself down on rate or gives itself more stats with Mr. Negative, but really good against the mirror match, truth be told, to steal opposing Iron Mans, opposing Mojos, even like opposing Punishers or Mr. Fantastics if they find themselves in this list in your opponent's version. The rest of this deck is kind of built around getting deeper into the deck to see more cards, when you've done the thing. Of course, the longer you have access to Mr. Negative's flipped cards or Serra's cost reduction, the more powerful things you're going to do. So by nature of that, we're using things like Jubilee and like Magic to give ourselves additional cards in play or extra turns of the game to really juice those bonuses provided by those cards. This deck is very powerful. It's kind of the amalgamation of existing archetypes to kind of create this end piece that's good on curve everywhere, great at reducing cards, and just super powerful even if it doesn't find its payoff. So if you're lucky enough to have the entire card pool for a deck like this, highly recommend trying it out. It is very, very, very competitive, so definitely worth taking a look if you can. Next up, we have the traditional top tier choice coming up for you next, Deathwave. Nothing really changed here. This deck is still very incredible and remains a mainstay of the format this week. If you're not familiar, the card Death, really big payoff, 9 cost unit, 12 attack, but gets cheaper for every card that you have destroyed over the course of the game. Unfortunately for people that do not like this deck, that is a reduction that applies after the effect of Wave. Wave, a 3 resource unit that is going to make the next thing you play cost 4, and if you've reduced Death's cost down by 5 or 4, you're going to play a death for free in a lot of cases on the last turn of the game. Sometimes multiple deaths in the versions of these decks playing cards like Moon Girl. When you can't do that and you can't pull off that ridiculous endgame synergy punch, you have access to just a kind of like a fair destruction-based mid-range deck. We get to create Demons with Hood, use Carnage and Deathblock to, even Killmonger to power through these early 1-drops and create us some really above-statted rates while destroying them and getting us cards destroyed for death. I think one of my favourite inclusions in this deck over the last few weeks has definitely been Rescue. Rescue, a card that was buffed in the most recent patch update, and just kind of the best thing you can do on rate on turn 4. Which is really, really strong. It gives you a lot of stats. It's not particularly synergistic with a deck, but it's really good at a deck that just wants to pour stats onto the board, which is very much what Deathwave is all about at its core. The endgame turns for this deck are still powerful enough to rival things like Serra Negative. Between Chavez Death and Leader Death, you just have these final turns of the game that put 20 plus stats into play, which is really good for early aggressive snapping that the opponent can't necessarily play around to score you chunks of extra cubes on the ladder. Deathwave, kind of a known quantity at this point, but remains one of the best decks you can play in Marvel Snap. We have a slightly different variation kind of mentioned. I apologise for scrolling too much. We're still kind of getting used to the using the website for this. Variation of Deathwave that we do kind of want to mention this week, kind of picking up in popularity as a different way to play a very similar archetype if you're lucky enough to have access to Deadpool. Deadpool is a unique pool 3 payoff that's going to double its attack every time it gets destroyed. So of course you want to destroy it as often and as regularly as you can. So we have these lists that are kind of more all in on destruction effects and less about the fair mid-range stuff. So we're playing more ways to kill things. You're playing your traditional Carnages and Deathblocks, Killmongers, but also Venom, another way of kind of just powering through early bodies. Deadpool, also a reason to play cards like Taskmaster and Moon Girl, because you're looking to just accentuate Deadpool and Death as your endgame stats as opposed to these other 6s. Sometimes Taskmaster can just be like 16 power, courtesy of Deadpool. Moon Girl can give you 2 massive Deadpools alongside some massive Deaths. This very picking up in popularity, sadly a bit hard to play if you do not have access to all the cards. It's definitely more synergistic than its more traditional brother. But very fun and definitely more aristocrat-esque if you come from the Magic sphere, and really enjoyable if you're into late game bursts of sometimes like 40 power on the final turns of the game, which is something that no other deck can really do. So well worth checking out the Deathpool variant if you have access to it. Sarah Miracle here, our last tier 1 deck for the week. This one is, again, kind of a known quantity at this point. It's traditional. It's not doing too bad. It's staying in its tier 1. It's kind of a lower ceiling take on the Mr. Negative deck at this point, because you have less ways of like cheating on energies. But Sarah Miracle's really just capable of developing stupid amounts of power on the final turn of the game, something that is just very, very strong in the current metagame. It's also more flexible than something like Sarah Negative, because you can include more tech cards to counterplay against your opponent. Things like Scarlet Witch are really popular inclusions in decks like this sometimes, mostly to counteract like opposing copies of Magic, to kind of turn off that expected turn 7 in mirror matches, which makes sense. You can kind of fit in more overall like strong cards, less synergistic cards, because you've got spots for tech choices in a deck like this. The version we're featuring here definitely showcasing the traditional like Lady Sif Ghost Rider package to let you cheat on the final turns of the game, alongside something like Swordmaster. But this isn't necessary in a deck like Sarah Miracle. You can just play whatever tech choices you want based on what you think the best decks are, and it's super flexible, which is really cool for people that enjoy that kind of mid-range strategy that can have unfair end games as well, in spots where you just need that kind of power. Would highly recommend trying out the Sarah Miracle deck to someone who's like less familiar with this archetype before you start playing the negative Sarah deck. You kind of need to be familiar how to abuse Sarah as a card, and this deck lets you get a grasp on that much better than the Sarah Negative deck, because that basically trades that linear game plan for more flexibility and more redundancy, where the Sarah Miracle deck definitely all about doing its thing on turn 6 with Sarah, and it's going to teach you those gameplay patterns really quickly if you want to get used to one of the mainstays of Tier 1. So Sarah Miracle looking great this week and definitely worth playing. Tier 2, traditional Mr. Negative this time around. So this deck is more fun, in my opinion, than Sarah Miracle. I'm a really big fan of it, but it's kind of got the same benefits to it as something like the Sarah Miracle deck we just talked about. You get less flexibility for a more linear game plan that is going to be as strong as possible early. This deck very much built around Mr. Negative and nothing else at its core. You're looking to play some flexible options because you've opened up space, but we're looking to flip our stats as early and often as possible in this deck. Gonna go a little deeper with more cards, much like the negative Sarah list with Jubilee and Magic to let us see more cards that have had their costs inverted. But we can do more powerful things in this deck as well. Late game combinations like Wong alongside Ironheart, Wolfsbane, White Tiger. These are all just exceptionally powerful things you can do, especially once Mr. Negative has flipped everything over. On top of that, we get to abuse things like Lockjaw in this deck. Lockjaw's a card I love. Lets you play these cheap cards and flip them back into your deck for now Mr. Negative inverted cards. Maybe superly overcharged Devil Dinosaurs or similar, which is just really, really strong in these late games as well. But definitely a little more high variance, perhaps, than some of the other end game decks of the format. An inclusion I love in this version of the deck is Gambit. Gambit kind of reserved mostly to those gimmicky Exodia combo decks with Mystique and Wong. But it doesn't have to be. It just ends up being a 1-cost, 3-attack unit after Mr. Negative has flipped it over, which is really good on rate, and it plays very, very well on that final turn alongside Wong to just kind of punk your opponent out of 2 of their cards with no real counterplay to a power play like that, which gives Gambit some real strength in an archetype like this. I love the Mr. Negative deck. It's not going anywhere. The card is just like too strong to not build around. But definitely a little weaker than the negative Sarah version this week, and finding itself in tier 2 for the more traditional version. Soundwave Lockdown, now this is definitely the anti-meta choice for folks that enjoy that kind of gameplay. A deck that I think not enough people respect, honestly. This is a deck kind of built at its core to counteract the other best decks in the game. If there is ways to interfere with their game plans, this deck is doing it, and Sandman kind of just finds itself becoming the single best tech choice you can make against the best decks in the room right now. Making them only be able to play 1 card a turn just completely counteracts all of this cost reduction and turn 6, turn 7 power plays that those decks are all about, because they just can't get the cards out of their hand. It doesn't matter how cheap they are if they're not allowed to play them all, which makes Sandman exceptionally strong and game-winning in a lot of spots. This deck is also just super flexible because it is a mid-range attrition deck by its nature. If you think there is a tech choice you can play in a deck like this that no one is respecting, maybe things like the Storm Juggernaut combo, or even like Scarlet Witch that we've talked about previously to turn off locations, there's easy ways to fit them in a deck like this over some of the less necessary cards. You're all about kind of distributing stats through Sandman with a deck like this. We get to abuse cards like Mr. Fantastic and Claw that let us play 1 card and add stats to multiple locations. And that's very similar to White Tiger, Doctor Doom, Leader, all these endgame cards we play that are going to, let us add multiple stats to multiple locations without playing multiple cards. In the King of Stats battle, Ebony Maw is just the best card you can play early. It's just such a ridiculous rate on a card in exchange for a downside. And then we play a little bit more in terms of flexibility. Things like Jubilee, again, just kind of shining in decks like this with so much top end. Captain Marvel, letting you play to a location and know that you can win another location, much like the rest of your top end. And we get this really cool 1-2 punch of Wave Odin in this deck, a combination that's very familiar with most folks at this point. Just going to be able to wave on 3, make Odin cost 4, Odin to re-trigger the wave, and make everything cost 4 on turn 5 as well. Really strong way of, again, turning off those final turns of the game and making the opponent's cheap hand not easy to play. Last but not least, card that I think is worth highlighting in this deck as well, just kind of the epitome of what it's all about. Doctor Doom, best home for that card at the moment. Just bodies across all locations, so very well statted, and just very, very strong in an archetype that is looking to play as few cards as possible and get the best value as it can from those cards while disrupting the opponent. So really big fan of Sandman Lockdown. Definitely a deck I would explore if you have access to most of the pool 3 cards in it. Hella Discard, of course, the casino deck of Marvel Snap. This one is kind of being refined by a lot of people. The sad truth, however, is it does mean the deck is becoming more pool 3 heavy, as a lot of the effects that it wants are just stuck in pool 3, which is a bit of a shame, really. However, that being said, if you like rolling the dice and kind of having the biggest, most high variance final turns of the game, this is definitely the deck for you. Hella, a 6-cost unit that is going to revive everything you've discarded on the last turn of the game when you play it. Now, we're going to do that a lot here, alongside Ghost Rider doing a very similar thing, by discarding just some completely overstatted, ridiculous fatties, courtesy of things like Lady Sif, Blade, Moon Knight, Swordmaster, these, even Hellcow. These are all effects that are going to let you get rid of Giganto, Magneto, Infinite, and just revive these things as necessary in the late game. There is, of course, some updates to this deck. The Invisible Woman tech has been here for a long time now, but if you're not familiar, hiding your discard effects and your Hella underneath Invisible Woman decreases your chance of discarding your Hella, which is how this deck tends to lose, is, of course, you're discarding at random. So discarding Hella is going to weaken your endgame quite significantly. So if you can keep those cards from revealing themselves until that big final turn, you can hide Hella underneath and have it reveal after your 2 discard effects, and just guarantee your revivals without risking giving up your Hella. The other update here is Black Cat. Black Cat, not a card that saw too much play in this archetype initially, But we're just looking for more ways to discard stuff for free. You will never play this card, basically ever, as far as I've seen. You just want to draw it and have it discard itself at some point over the course of the game. And it'll be a free 6 stats you can revive off of Hela. It's definitely worth keeping in mind that Ghost Rider can often be disrupted by Black Cat. So you're going to want to be careful to not accidentally just revive a Black Cat if you're going for a quick Ghost Rider Infinite play, or even just like Ghost Rider Giganto. You'd much rather revive the much larger unit than the Black Cat, so just keep an eye on when it's discarding itself in the traditional sense. But yeah, well-known deck at this point. Hela discard, super high variance, but very, very fun finding itself in Tier 2 this week. Discard combo, definitely the more swarm-based deck. Fallen out of favour, honestly. It's a bit of a shame. The Collector nerf definitely made this deck weaker. It's harder to maintain board state stats. It's just kind of hard to play, unfortunately. It's not an ongoing ability, so you can't double it up with Mystique, which definitely leaves it kind of without a home, unfortunately. That being said, this deck is still very powerful, doing all kinds of ridiculous things to abuse Swarm. Swarm here, a 2-cost unit. Every time you discard it, you'll get 2 copies back into your hand. Plays very, very well with all the cheap discard effects here. Colleen Wing, just perfect with Swarm. Lady Sif, perfect with Apocalypse, both of which play very, very well with the Collector. Your other discard outlets, Dracula in the late game is going to make a huge unit, courtesy of the Apocalypse that should be in your hand. Swordmaster, Gambit, more good ways of discarding. Wong in this deck is kind of ridiculous. You can even duplicate it with Mystique. It's ridiculous, in my opinion, that you're able to do this. Because you just get to abuse these discard effects twice and just create such a stupidly large amount of copies of Swarm that your final turn of the game, you will have no empty spots. So this deck is really good at finishing those win a location with 4 cards missions, just because you will have way more cards than your opponent from the copies of Swarm that you should make. Magic, once again, giving you the ability to have some late game flexibility, just one of the best cards in the game right now. Just a known archetype, one that a lot of people love, but definitely needs a little more exploration on how to get it back on the map. It's falling a little short and continues to find itself making its way down the tier list. So gotta kind of, you know, try some things that maybe haven't been tried so far. I know the article here from Den has some suggestions in the form of things like America Chavez, whether or not you should be playing Moon Knight and Blade still. Well worth checking this out if you want to, about how we can update this deck and make it a more strong contender. Tier 3 this week, Destroyer, staying where it was. This deck, you know, kind of very, very popular early. Got really super popular upon the release of Daredevil in the Season Pass, but kind of maintaining its Tier 3 status for a while now. The main goal of this deck, guarantee a lane with Professor X, and then guarantee another one by playing Destroyer that is going to, of course, wipe out everything that is not in the Professor X lane. You can, of course, circumvent this drawback even further with cards like Armor, Bucky Barnes, other cards that are okay with being destroyed. Warpath, a huge benefit to only playing to 2 locations. And cards like Green Goblin, fantastic at not being cards that you're going to destroy because you're giving them to your opponents, much like Hobgoblin in this deck as well. So, pretty linear one-track deck, but very, very strong at doing the thing it's supposed to do. The sad truth is, unfortunately, this deck kind of falling off because people are finding better ways to have their late game turns. These turn 6, turn 7 decks from Serra are just putting out more power than Destroyer. You're very much having to secure early Professor X's on locations to guarantee a win, and that's becoming a little bit harder, which is why this deck finds itself in Tier 3. That being said, linear game plans are always strong. This once again benefiting from those great destruction payoffs that see play in so many decks now. And Destroyer is just the largest statted minion you can play by itself on the last turn of the game. And that has something to be said for it, and definitely worth checking out as a result. The Bounce deck, this one is just a fan favourite, honestly. I love Bounce, I know a lot of people love Bounce. This one kind of finding its way to adapting after the nerfs and after the changes. Another deck that was a low blow from the Collector nerf and has found itself kind of not wanting Collector anymore and choosing to be more disruptive in its traditional package than raw stats like it used to be. We're still playing Bishop and Angela. Those cards are just too good alongside Beast and Falcon to not play. Looking to just turbo stats onto those cards. and back them up in the final turns of the game with America Chavez or Demons from the Hood being bounced back and forth, which will hopefully be enough to win you 2 locations. However, there are some changes here. Going to be a little more disruptive to the opponent. We get to play Korg, and the new one for me, at least in my opinion, is Black Widow. This is a card that wasn't too popular in this deck previously, but picking it up with Beast is just really disruptive. You get to create all these Widow's bites that your opponent might struggle to find places to put, and it's going to stop them drawing cards if they don't find places to put them. Really, really strong effect. Only downside, of course, the popularity of things like Carnage and Venom does mean they can clear those spaces, but that is not a reason to not play the card, much like it's not a reason to not play Green Goblin. Just still very strong, very disruptive, always going to stop them drawing 2 cards over the course of 6 turns, which is a lot of denial, and might stop them finding those Terrors, finding those Mr. Negatives, and definitely from finding more Mr. Negative inverted cards. So Black Widow may be a card which we'll be keeping our eyes on for more decks moving forward. Also, just still love the synergy package that's tucked in here of Human Torch, Iron Fist, and Cloak. Just letting you kind of repeatedly pick up Iron Fist and Human Torch from Beast and Falcon. And just continue to double Human Torch's attack, which is just such a cool little package in this deck, and definitely recommend it once you open Human Torch. But definitely something this deck can play without. You're allowed to play Bounce once you've got access to Beast and Falcon, and everything else you kind of need for this deck is in Pool 2. And the big power level upgrades definitely come from Hood and Human Torch later in Pool 3, but they are not required to play the archetypes. So definitely worth checking out if you've recently cracked Beast or Falcon. I just think this deck is one of the most fun ways to play Marvel Snap, so highly, highly recommend. Okay, so onto this new tier. Kind of gets said itself here by Den. I think this is something that we want to do in the future, kind of support people that are getting into the game, and kind of talk about your options of most impactful cards from Pool 2 that you can use to play against these Pool 3 decks you're probably starting to bump into as you climb the ranks. But maybe you don't have access to those cards, so we want to be able to help you do our best up until that point. Now, it's important for us, of course, to say these decks are not ranked in the tier list, and they're obviously weaker than the optimized decks that are running several of the most impactful cards in the game. But Marvel Snap is a game with a unique acquisition model, and we have to work with what we have, and we want to help in that regard. So once again, feedback on this kind of stuff appreciated, as we want to make more content in this vein. So the first deck here, Sandman Aggro, exclusively Pool 2 as a result. A really big fan of this one. As we talked earlier on, I think Sandman, just a really underexplored card in general, that's just so good against all of the best decks in the game right now. There's no one you're upset to see Sandman against. And if we can kind of combine that into an aggressively styled shell, we can outrate our opponent. We're just playing big haymakers here that we don't mind playing the 1 spell a turn. Once again, Ebony Maw, really strong alongside Sandman, just because of the amount of stats that it offers. And we want 1-drops alongside Kazar in this deck. Kazar being played with all these early 1s that you can get down before Sandman. Means that you just suddenly have a pile of stats in every location, especially alongside Ant-Man, whose ongoing effect is going to be of benefit there as well. Angela plays super well with all these 1s. Okoye playing super great with Sandman as well, just jumping up the stats on everything you're going to draw. It's going to make it better to only be playing 1 card a turn. In the final turns of the game, when we are only playing 1 card, the best things we can be doing are playing these super above rate minions. Iron Man, of course, just a mainstay in so many strategies due to that really powerful ongoing effect. Claw, fantastic at putting stats on multiple locations. And of course, America Chavez, the guaranteed draw on turn 6. That is often going to provide you 10 powers worth of stats thanks to Okoye, or sometimes even more if you can place it next to Iron Man or Angela or Ant-Man in the final turns of the game. So really strong finish for a deck like this. I think Sandman is definitely the way to go once you've opened it in Pool 2. It's just such a fantastic anti-meta tool right now, and is, in my opinion, the best way to attack the upcoming meta game. So highly recommend this one. Pool 2 Control. Love this deck. This is one that I've not actually seen that much of, but I've heard really good things from the Reddit community. I know decks like this have been popping up over on Reddit a ton. And I think it's great. Kind of looking to control your opponent is definitely the way to go when you're missing some of these haymakers. If you can stop them playing their haymakers, you're on more of a level playing field, which I think is just very clever and very well thought out. So looking to keep control of locations and minions with a deck like this. You'll see things like Storm that are going to turn off locations that might be problematic for you. Professor X locking up locations that you already have control over. And then we get some of the big, like, stop your opponent from having so many stats cards. Scorpion and Spider-Woman really strong at taking stats off of cards that are in hand or in play, and just really good things to Jubilee into, honestly, as well. Sunspot Okoye, really good at these early stats, which is what you want in a deck like this. And I love the inclusion of Shang-Chi. Shang-Chi really solid against these decks at the moment that are getting still big collectors, or yeah, Monster Isle, any of the Dr. Octopus style game plans. Anyone who's putting in like large chunks of power on single units towards the end of the game, Shang-Chi is going to win those locations for you on turn 6 a lot of the time with very little counterplay from your opponent. The end game here, super strong. Once again, America Chavez, the guaranteed end game rate. Odin plays very well alongside Jubilee, even Shang-Chi, Spider-Woman, sometimes even Scorpion and Killmonger. Really good to reuse these on-reveal triggers. And the Infernaut here, not a card you're often going to play. Sometimes you will skip turn 5 if you do not have Professor X to guarantee 20 stats on turn 6. But for the most part, this exists to be a high roll off of Jubilee. It doesn't matter how strong your opponent's deck is. Sometimes if you just Jubilee into 21 powers worth of stats, that location is locked and there's very little they can do about it. So it's great to kind of have that high roll built into this pseudo control deck. Really good use of some of the most powerful cards in Pool 2. Highly recommend trying this one out. If you're more of a fan of adapting an existing strategy to Pool 2 only, this is our best consideration for that. Welcome to Discard Swarm in Pool 2, a deck that is kind of just a known mainstay at this point, and most of its important pieces are found in Pool 2. Swarm is there, even Bishop, Angela, Lady Sif, Apocalypse. These are all cards you see in the OG version above. That can all be found really early into your Marvel Snap journey, which is kind of fantastic. This deck looking to accentuate what it's missing with additional stats. It gets to play things like Okoye and Ant-Man to increase the stat level of your cards and maybe give you a slightly higher playing field. Ant-Man, great with all these swarms, by the way. It's really easy to fill a location and just get the extra stats off of Ant-Man in a deck like this. Cloak, really strong, surprisingly, in a strategy like this. It's very powerful to be able to move your Bishops and Angelas around. It's definitely not something your opponent's going to expect a lot of the time either. So being able to take these hugely statted minions you've built in the early game, shift them over to another location that your opponent isn't in, really powerful. Also really good at filling up an Ant-Man location when your opponent maybe didn't think you had the ability to do that, which is something else that definitely is a testament to Cloak in an archetype like this. But most of the big discard payoffs are here. You still have access to Blade, still have access to Swordmaster, Lady Sif. These are all things you're just super happy to do alongside Swarm and Apocalypse for the end game of multiple copies of Swarm and a really big copy of Apocalypse or America Chavez. So yeah, highly recommend giving this one a spin if you're interested in the discard synergies and currently in Pool 2. Yeah, so that's going to be our tier list for this week. Outside of some novelty, some changes in Tier 1, mostly the Sarah Negative deck and Deadpool kind of making a fruition in the Deathwave deck. The rest of the metagame hasn't changed that much this week, especially the Pool 2 and Pool 3 decks. They're looking to be kind of like solidly anchored in the positions they're in, and are kind of waiting for exterior events to kind of progress further, whether we see more cards released, a balanced patch, or maybe some competitive play from an official launch once we come out of beta from Second Dinner. I think we're going to need something like that now to shake this metagame up. It is looking fairly established, with the most powerful cards kind of being determined at this point. If you have enjoyed this tier list, let me know below. I want to hear about it. I want to know what you'd like me to change in the future and what we can do for you over at Marvel Snap Zone. Once again, please consider subscribing if you are enjoying the content. Would love to be able to keep doing this for you. Hopefully stuff like this is just beneficial to your journey and you're enjoying Marvel Snap so far. Thanks for checking it out. Once again, check out the articles over on Marvel Snap Zone, and hopefully I will see you again very soon. I've been Howling Minds, you've been amazing, and this has been Marvel Snap Zone.